Professor Rolfe, the theme of the conference is anticipating the future, risk management for long-term planning. It's a mouthful, but how did you come up with it?
I guess we tried to encapsulate what we believe everyone's doing and perhaps doing badly. I have to admit I have some misgivings. When you look at the title, you either have to be very optimistic or perhaps very cynical to really read that with a straight face. Because who can really engage in long-term planning with certainty or anticipate the future? It almost sounds like we weren't serious.
But risk is a very popular subject these days, isn't it? There are communities springing up all around the world in practically every profession, industry, sector.
Yes, I mean, even in advertising now, we have people who are talking about your public relations risk. It's no longer something that's confined to the engineers, which is what we're used to. So I have a certain amount of knowledge in electricity markets. And in electricity, of course, it was the engineering heaven because you could kind of control everything. But we're learning now that energy is much more about, are we willing to change our consumption patterns, for example? These are things that are certainly so far away from traditional risk. You know, they're on a different page.
Traditional risk is very interesting in itself, and the overall picture I'm getting is that you've got to have imagination. You can't look to the future without imagining possibly worst case scenarios.
Yes, I think people use scenarios very imaginatively. We try to use scenarios to explore both risks and opportunities. We have to keep the opportunities in mind, even though we tend to focus on the risks. I think one of the more innovative uses of scenarios recently has been something called reverse scenarios, where instead of trying to imagine how you got to a particular place from where we are now, you say, suppose we had arrived at a particular place which I don't want to be in. I've lost 20% of my retail customers as a business. If I were in that position, how could I have possibly got there? And by working backwards, it prompts you to think of things you never would have thought of if you'd thought of, well, I know where I am today. I know who my competitors are today. I know what regulation is today. So this reverse stress testing is verging on what some academics would call falsification. You have an idea. What's one way to test it? It's not to look for supporting facts. It's actually to look for things, look for areas, look for situations where it's palpably incorrect. And that's what reverse stress testing is about.
The AGM is academically led. So how do you deal with the question, what do you know about real risk? Because you're looking at it from an academic point of view.
Yes, we have to admit that we shouldn't be apologetic about it. We have to say up front that what we can bring to the table is views that aren't necessarily embodied already in operations or in manuals or in known strategies. We have to take account of those, but we really have to ask ourselves, are they doing the job? And I don't want to be critical. It's easy to point at the mistakes. It's easy to say we had a massive financial meltdown and to look at some of the predictions of the Bank of England where you had what's called a fan chart. This is a typical kind of example in finance. So looking forward from today, you see, we think the future is going to go like this, but the further out we predict over time, you'll notice it fans out because we're less and less certain. But then you look at the actual, and the actual leaves the fan entirely. So our idea of future probabilities of events and the actuals are somehow unrelated, even when we try to incorporate these uncertainties. So what we'd like to do is take those as a starting point and then say, all right, our methodology where we have events and we have probabilities and we have exceedance curves, which is the insurance jargon, we need that, but there are some places where it just doesn't really describe it. It may be helpful as a conversation tool, but somehow we're not capturing it.
One of the lessons, I guess, is that, yes, history is full of all sorts of examples, all sorts of chronology. Actually, that doesn't really help very much when it comes to assessing or trying to predict what risk is going to be.
Yes, well, a conversation we had this morning was around exactly that point. The question was put, actually, by a speaker. He was challenging, if you like, a view that you can use data. So again, if you're from the insurance industry, you do use historical scenarios, but they're typically around natural catastrophes. And there's a kind of belief that, although the weather might be changing, if we understood those trends, we would be able to predict at least the frequency of high-impact storms better. But if you're talking about political events, you know there's a chance that Egypt may change regimes. And depending on who you talk to, some people would say, oh yes, we wondered why it took so long. So even when we have a history of these things, predicting the when of them, it's extremely difficult. And if you talk to people who study earthquakes, that sounds like it's a purely physical issue, plate tectonics, etc. But many of those people will refuse to make predictions. What they can say is they know that certain kinds of earthquakes occur with a certain kind of frequency, but they may be overdue or they may be early. What they can't say is when the next one is going to happen. And that's really the issue that we face as well with the big shocks.
Professor Ralph, thank you very much.
Thank you.